honor and I'm privileged to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Maryia Bakhtsiyarava. And Dr. Maryia Bakhtsiyarava earned a BS in Geography with a concentration in Geographic Information Systems from the Belarusian State University, as well as a PhD in Geography from the University of Minnesota in Twin Cities, my alma mater, so we have something in common. At the University of Minnesota, Maryia received formal training in demography and population studies as part of the NIH-funded population training program. Dr. Bakhtsiyarava's work integrates approaches from geography, demographics, climate science, as well as remote sensing and epidemiology. She draws on a lot of extensive experience in working with large data sets to combine data on people and from population surveys, censuses, administrative records, with data on the environment derived from gridded data sets, remotely sensed images, emission inventories, among others. Now, most recently, she has been a postdoctoral scholar here at the University of California, Berkeley, in the Department of City and Regional Planning, working with Professor Daniel Rodriguez on a project investigating the urban determinants of health and health disparities in Latin American cities. She is the first author on several high-impact publications and continues to work on understanding how features of cities, including their transportation systems, impact health. And today she's given a talk titled Greenspace and Mental Health in Mexico, and really looking forward to finding out her insights and her research. And please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. Hi everyone, thank you so much, Abby, for such a warm introduction. Today I will present some work that is ongoing, but most of it is we need to revise and resubmit to a journal, but it's a collaboration that I'm doing with some colleagues who are or used to be at Berkeley, at the Landscape and Architecture department, as well as with Dr. Daniel Rodriguez, who is at the ITS and also at City and Regional Planning, as well as my co-authors and collaborators from the Cellular project, which I'll mention a bit later. So just to provide a little bit, just a tiny little background about myself. So yes, I received my PhD at the University of Minnesota. And while there, I worked on the IPUMS projects, which are some of the world's largest projects that combine environmental and population data, and also just process and disseminate population data from national and international surveys and censuses. And so I think that those research assistantships that I had as part of my PhD back in Minnesota shaped my research identity in a very big way, because it made me really passionate about understanding how the way we construct variables, the way we work with the data actually has implication further downstream when we actually do the analysis and interpret our findings. Right now, I'm a postdoc, as Avi also mentioned, and I work on this project called Urban Health in Latin America, or Cellular. And it's a collaboration between, in the US, it's mostly Berkeley and Drexel. So at Drexel, we have a lot of statisticians, biostatisticians, epidemiologists. At Berkeley, we mostly look at the environmental side of things. And it's in general, it's a very large collaboration across multiple universities in the US, but we also work with a lot of partners in Latin America. And the goal of that project, of which the study that I will present today is a part of, is to understand the determinants of health and health disparities in Latin American cities. So we focus on, overall in our project, we have about 371 large cities, so large with a population of at least 100,000 people, and we have compiled different data on the built and natural environment and health, and that's what we try to work with, and that's what I'll be presenting today. So the talk is about mental health and green space. And mental health and mental health related disorders are a serious problem that the world is facing right now. So much so that the WHO mentioned that there can be no sustainable development without mental health, and it designated mental health and mental health related goals as part of its sustainable development agenda. And as you can see, as much as 70% of the people overall in the world do not receive treatment for mental health disorders, and that number is actually higher in low and middle income countries. So I'm focusing on Mexico, and our project overall is in Latin America. And in Latin America, that number is even higher, up to 85%. And overall, the mental health problems are not only costly to individuals, but also to the global economy at large, because they are ranked, the depressive disorders are ranked the 13th leading cause of disability-adjusted life years. But as the WHO designated mental health as part of its sustainable development agenda, the researchers also started trying to understand various determinants of mental health, not only individual level factors, but also factors in the built and natural environments where people live. And so overall, I'm going to talk about green space, which is just one aspect of the built in natural environment. And overall, we know there is a lot of research that show the linkages between elements of the built and natural environment and mental health, but these pathways are quite complex. And the relationship between green space and mental health and health in general is quite complex, and it involves several pathways. So some pathways have to do with the fact that that green space in particular can provide cooling, better air quality, and so forth, and that can also be associated with improved mental health. At the same time, green space can also improve or boost mental health by providing, because individuals can just interact with nature, and that, there are some different theories in literature, but some people say that just being in nature and being able to interact with natural objects and so forth, it can be very beneficial. And so in general, these pathways are of course complex, can be mediated by and modified by different things, but overall that's the pathway that we usually think about. And in particular, green space is very salient to health and mental health in general in urban contexts, because in urban contexts there are the opportunities for contact with nature are diminished because there are so many such a large percentage of the surface area that is occupied by concrete, glass, and steel. And just in general, those opportunities are diminished. Now, this is particularly relevant for Mexico and in Latin America in general, because there in that region, and it's still continuing to be one of the most highly urbanizing regions in the world, the pace of urbanization has been supercharged. So you can see from this graph that Mexico is shown in this, sorry, I don't have a laser pointer, as this yellow line here. And what you can see is that back in the 50s, most of the Mexican population lived in rural areas. But it only took the Mexican population about 4 decades, from the 50s to the 90s, for 2/3 of it to live in cities. So it was a very drastic, very fast-paced urbanization process, and it resulted into a lot of people who moved into cities, and the cities weren't always prepared for that influx. In terms of providing basic services such as sanitation, water, hygiene, and so forth. So on the one hand, of course, urbanization is key to Mexico's socioeconomic development because it provides job opportunities and so forth. But on the other hand, it also creates a lot of problems for the ecosystem services, and also when cities grow, they need to clear space. Including green space to build housing and so forth, and so that results into the disruption and the reduction in the provision of green space overall. Now, if we just look at this graph, so what you can see on the left is this the WHO guidelines. Is this one measure that you can often see in papers about green space that say that the standard is supposed to be about 9 square meters of green space per capita in urban contexts. So that's the statistic. There's some controversy or some maybe confusion about how it was derived, but that's one thing that you usually see in papers. That's the standard to strive for. Then if you look at what we actually have in Mexico, there is about 100 square meters of green space per resident overall in Mexican City. So, on the surface, it may look like Mexico has so much green space, there's nothing really to worry about. But in reality, that green space is distributed very unevenly throughout the cities. And that pattern, actually, of how unevenly it is distributed is a bit different from what we usually observe in rich countries such as the US and Western Europe. So even though in the surface, it may look like Mexico has a lot of green space, it may not necessarily be available to everyone, and it's not necessarily maybe even where people live. So overall, from the current research, we know that the current evidence on these linkages between green space and mental health is not sufficient or specific enough, even though there are a lot of studies that report positive associations. And I have to say that a lot of the research on this topic comes from rich countries, then also China and some other countries in East Asia, but there's very little research on that in Latin America in particular, but also just in general in low and middle income countries. There's also limited exploration of the causal pathways, and that of course can be quite complicated because those pathways of what it is about greenery that may be beneficial to mental health is actually quite hard to establish, to isolate and tease out. But on the other hand, in general, when you look at the green space side of this green space and mental health research, what you can notice is that there's a limited scope of the green space metrics that are used. And oftentimes there's, say like one metric or several metrics that describe oftentimes the amount of greenery within, a residential neighborhood where a person lives or something like that. And there's not a lot of studies, particularly in health. It's a little bit better in landscape ecology, I think, but not a lot of studies so far that look at how other aspects of green space, other than just its amount, but say things like configuration and the arrangement of green space in space, how they are associated with mental health. So, for example, which is what I just mentioned, and so I have an example. So here you can see just the footprints of two cities, and everything that's in green, you can disregard that they're in different colors, but everything in green is the patches of green space. And we have Mexico City in Mexico, and then we have the city of David in Panama. And just by visually inspecting the image, you can see that it looks like there's probably more percent area that is covered by green space in Mexico City than in David, Panama. And of course that is true, but then if you look at another popular metric that is often used to approximate the amount and intensity of vegetation, and in this case in particular it's the median annual and median maximum annual NDVI, what you can actually see is that in the city of David, Panama, that statistic, that NDVI, which is the normalized difference vegetation index, it is actually 0.4 units higher in the city of David, Panama than in Mexico City. And currently, there is not a lot of understanding of whether, say, this difference has any bearing on the results and the subsequent associations that we see with mental health. And another thing I should mention is that, here you can also see that green space is arranged in a certain way, right? So for example, you can see that there seems to be these green belts around the peripheries, although in Mexico City maybe there's more green space throughout the city as well. And so, and of course it's hard to provide a visual example of the green space arrangement, but those things, how green space is distributed across cities, is another thing that hasn't been that well explored in public health research. Now, another challenge relates to how exposure is measured. And of course, in geography, it's a well-known fact that the choice of spatial units for measuring exposure has tremendous implications for empirical results. We also don't really, oftentimes when exposure is measured at these particular buffers within a residential address or just within an administrative unit, we don't really know whether individual only interacts with the green space in their unit, or they also go out and take advantage of the green space that exists in their city overall. And in general, it's probably doesn't even make sense to try to approximate that perfect neighborhood, especially at a large level. And what we should really try to think about is whether the measure for green space for the spatial context that we have available, right, whether it's a neighborhood or some district or a city, is actually causally relevant, is a reasonable proxy for the true causally relevant spatial context. Another thing that I think is interesting, and that I won't be talking about this too much today, but I just wanted to provide an example, is that oftentimes when these green space measured are derived, in particular in DVI, they are summarized at some level, right? Say temporal level, say it can be an annual, average annual NDVI or something like that. But there's, as you can see from this graph, which shows 3 different cities in Mexico and how the mean monthly NDVI varies throughout the year, you can see that all these cities have quite different patterns, which of course makes sense because, where NDVI and the greening of vegetation depends on, where a city is located relative to the equator and so forth. And what you can see is that there is a lot of variability, not just within a city, but also between them. And if we just average things out to say one measure per year, there's a lot of temporal granularity that we are losing. And it makes sense that if we're trying to think about mental health, that vegetation could be most useful when it's the greenest, right? But if we average it out, we may kind of lose that aspect. So that is also currently not well understood. So with these things in mind, what we wanted to do here is just look at at whether associations between depressive symptoms and green space vary depending on the use of different green space metrics, and whether the spatial scale at which these metrics are measured influence these associations. So for this project, we used the Mexico's National Survey on Health and Nutrition, also called as NSANUT, from 2012. And the respondents were surveyed between January 2011 and March 2012. And overall, after excluding some missing data, so the final sample that we were working with had about 17,000 people from 680 neighborhoods in 36 large cities in Mexico. So the way the cities were defined, they were defined by the urban extent, which itself was obtained by combining the official administrative boundary with the built-up area from the Atlas of Urban Expansion. And so basically what I mean by cities is not necessarily just the administrative area of the city itself, but it's the densest built-up core, so that urban cluster. And another scale that we looked at was neighborhoods. And according to Mexico census, neighborhoods are defined as these basic geostatistical areas. And they are usually comprised of 1 to 50 blocks, and they have to be clearly delimited by streets, avenues, walkways, or any other easily identifiable features. Of course, it would be ideal to also have the residential address of the respondents, but unfortunately, we didn't have that. And I think that could really complement this paper. So we had 36 large cities that were distributed throughout the entirety of Mexico. And for our outcome, we focused on the Center for Epidemiological Studies Depression's scale. It was a seven question scale. And it was basically respondents were asked a series of questions about how they felt and about the frequency. They were also asked the frequency of those symptoms, and then their responses were summed up and categorized as depressive as a dichotomous score. So if a person, based from the 7 questions and the frequency of their symptoms, had a score of more than 8 points, then they were categorized as having clinically significant depressive symptoms. If it was less, they were considered to have no depressive symptoms. Now you may ask, why didn't we do a doctor-diagnosed depression or something like that? Well, the individuals who, there might be some selection bias in terms of who actually goes to the doctor to seek treatment for or just counsel for depression. And so in a lot of the epidemiological literature, they sometimes, they often rely on these self-reported scores so as not to bias that by, say, SES or so forth, because if a person doesn't have insurance, for example, they may not be, or just other resources, they may not be able to go to the doctor. So that's why we used that score. And it was actually validated for Mexico specifically. Now, in terms of the green space, we used 3 main sources of data. So we used the normalized difference vegetation index, which measures the amount and intensity of vegetation. And I'll talk about this, this metric in more detail. So it comes from a satellite. Then another aspect that was sort of another data source for green space that we use is a green space map that was derived from classifying Sentinel-2 satellite images. And then the final kind of green space data was the data on urban parks. And that data was obtained by fusing together the Sentinel data and using the geotagged park locations from the Google Cloud Collaborative Platform. So we had these 3 types of green space data to work with. So as I mentioned, we have the median and annual maximum in DVI that we computed for every neighborhood and every city. And it was, overall, it was available at a 250-meter spatial resolution, and it was available every 16 days. So we needed to compute the median of the annual maximum in DVI for each spatial unit. Then from the land cover map, we derived several measures of green space. So the way you can think of what that green space land cover map is when I showed those a slide with the green space footprints for Mexico City and the city of David in Panama, those green things where the green pixels was green space, and then from those maps, we computed different metrics. So one is just % of area that is covered by green space. That I think is pretty self-explanatory. And then the other 3 measures are landscape characteristics of green space, and they described how it's distributed across the landscape, and they are fragmentation, isolation, and aggregation. So to get a better idea of what they are is the fragmentation measures the density of the green patches. So you can think of, say, clumps of greenery and then measure how distributed they are throughout a landscape. That's fragmentation. Now, if you think of aggregation, it describes the extent to which those green space clumps or clusters tend to cluster together. So you can think, another example you can think of here is that, say, you have a landscape with just a bunch of standalone trees that would have low aggregation, or you can have a landscape with several large parks, and that would be considered high aggregation. Finally, the isolation is also easier to understand from its name. That just describes the average distance in meters across all green patches. So if you look at the entire, city footprint or neighborhood footprint, and if you compute the distance between all of the patches, that would be the metric describing isolation. And just as an example, so you can kind of see it here, although I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you can have examples of how these metrics relate to one another. So for example, in the upper left corner, you can see an example. It's the city of Teresópolis in Brazil, and you can see that the green space there, you can see that most of it's green there. Yeah, sure, there's some white in the middle, but overall it looks like a very intense green. Doesn't look like there's that many green space white gaps between those, well, compared to all the other cities. And that is an example of a city that has, where those patches are very low fragmented. At the same time, because they're also tend to kind of cluster together, they tend to be closer, and that is why we also have low isolation. And that is, say, very different from the city of La Paz in Mexico that has both high fragmentation. So you can see that these green space dots are distributed just throughout the entire city, and there are also not that many of them, so they tend to be smaller, and so they also tend to stay far apart from one another. So that is an example of high fragmentation and high isolation. Now, the final measure that we had to do with, so the three types of metrics that I just described, they describe the characteristics of green space, but that is present within the administrative boundary, right? So it's either within a city or within a neighborhood. But these metrics don't really allow us to get at whether individuals may or if what kind of green space is available outside of that rigid administrative neighborhood or city boundary. And so to complement this, we also computed a measure of green space across continuous space. And that we did with the help of kernel density. So in general, kernel density estimation is a technique. It uses local information to produce densities of features at any given point in space. So it produces a smooth continuous surface of probability density using some distance function. And what we did is that we computed a kernel density surface by fitting a smooth surface to each point, to each green space pixel from that binary green space map. So for example, sort of the input that we had was on the left. You can see those green pixels. Everything that's not green is not green space. And then we converted them to points and computed this kernel density. And then we had to summarize it at a neighborhood or city level. And we use different search radii to compute the density. So say the larger the search radius, the more green space around it, around that point is included. So I wouldn't say it works exactly as a buffer, but maybe it is a useful analog to think about it. And so overall, we have these four kinds of measures. So we have, just as a reminder, we had the NDVI, which measures the amount and vigor of vegetation. We also had the green space map, from which we computed percent green and all those different landscape metrics. We also had a measure of urban parks, which included I realized that I didn't mention the urban park metric, sorry. The number of parks per capita, the park area per capita, percent area covered by parks, and distance to nearest park. So what I should also mention is that when I was describing the measures related to space, green space configuration, and so it's these ones. So because the neighborhoods are so small, it wasn't computationally meaningful to compute these metrics at such a small level. Because if a neighborhood is say 500 by 500 meters, then the measure of isolation may not be as informative, and say there may be very few patches of greenery in that neighborhood, and then that would result into very artificially low numbers for, say, or high numbers for isolation. So these metrics were only computed, the green space land cover metrics were only computed at the city level. Now, because we wanted to see whether these different metrics had any bearing on or it resulted into different results, different associations with our mental health outcome, we estimated multi-level logit models for each green space metric separately. And so what we did is that we had the models where we had the dependent variable, which measured whether or not an individual expressed depressive symptoms. So that was a binary measure. And then we have measures of individual age, sex, marital status, and so forth. And then we estimated separate models for each green space metric separately. And then we did it both at the city level, and then we did it also at the neighborhood level. So we had different models for the different scales and for the different green space metrics. Now, we also explored effect modification by things such as the neighborhood and employment rate. We also used the city social environmental index, and sort of to get a little bit at transportation, we also explored whether car ownership and walking may play a role. And so on the other hand, car ownership can actually boost mobility and allow people to go to places and maybe even reach more green space than compared to people who don't have cars, but at the same time can also expose people to elements and travel delay, and just being stuck in traffic has been itself, even regardless of green space, shown to be associated with depressive symptoms, including in Latin America. So I will present results for the associations between the odds of experiencing depressive symptoms and the green space metrics. I will first look at the neighborhood level scale. So these results, again, they are from these single exposure metrics. And so each, so far I'm not showing the results. So each metric is from a separate model. And what I have on the x-axis is the odds ratio. So our hypotheses were that, say, more ample green space, so higher percent green space, higher NDVI, and in general, all these metrics would be associated with a decrease in the probability of experiencing depressive symptoms. So the expected associations would be to the left from 0, so they would be smaller because it would be associated with to the left from 1. So it would be associated with a decrease. So now what we see is that for the measures describing the quantity of vegetation, especially the percent green space at the neighborhood level, the median of annual maximum NDVI at the neighborhood level, we see that those measures are associated with a decrease in the odds of experiencing depressive symptoms. So, for example, just to give you an idea of the magnitude, is that a 1 standard deviation increase in the percentage of neighborhood area that is covered by green space is associated with roughly a 6.5 lower odds of experiencing depressive symptoms, and that is adjusted for individual age, sex, neighborhood level, socioeconomic characteristics, and so forth. And we also observe a similar magnitude for percent green. Now, switching to urban parks, we actually find that, as you can see, all these confidence intervals cross the 1, so they're not statistically significant, and also the point estimates are quite close to 0. So for the measures describing urban parks, we don't really see associations. Now, another measure that was summarized at the neighborhood level was that green space measured across continuous space, and that was the one obtained through the kernel density estimation. And what you can see here is that for all of these measures, regardless of the search radius that we used to produce it, all of these measures were associated with a decrease in the odds of experiencing depressive symptoms. So what that basically means is that the more green space there is, say, within your neighborhood, as well as the area surrounding your neighborhood, so the more area there is, the less likely that person residing in that neighborhood to report depressive symptoms. And what is also interesting is that it appears, and that actually might be a sign of some scale effects going on, is that you can see that as the search radius goes up, so we used a range from 250 meters, 500 meters, 1, 2, and 3 kilometers, so the effect estimate is actually increases, and so the resulting decrease in the odds of experiencing depressive symptoms also goes up. Now, if we look at the city level measures, and again, here we again will have percent green space and DVI and parks, but in addition, we'll also have these landscape metrics because we couldn't compute them at the neighborhood level. So what you can see here is that very consistently with what we observed for the neighborhoods, we see that more green space at the city level and higher NDVI at the city level are also associated with a decrease in the odds of experiencing depressive symptoms. Now, if we look at the measures describing the configuration of green space, so it's the fragmentation, aggregation, and isolation, we didn't really see, you see that all those results contain the null, so they're not statistically significant. And the measure of urban parks, so interestingly, there's this one measure that is percent area of a city that is covered by parks. So these measures, that measure was associated, interestingly, with an increase in the odds of experiencing depressive symptoms, but the other measures were not. Now, we also did not observe any evidence of effect modification by area level characteristics. Now, this transportation angle that I explored a little bit is that even without looking at green space, we saw that car owners overall as a group were 6% less likely to report depressive symptoms than non-car owners controlling for other SES characteristics. So in general, as a group, it appears that car owners were less likely to report depressive symptoms, and that is without even considering green space. At the same time, what was also interesting is that meeting walking recommendations, which was measured as at least 150 minutes of walking per week, actually decreased the risk of reporting depressive symptoms consistently for both groups, but still those, all of those intervals contain the null. But then, if we bring in green space, what we did see is that the associations between green space and depressive symptoms for car owners were not statistically significant, whereas for non-owners, all those results that I showed in the main, like on the previous slides, they did hold. So it might mean that there might be some evidence of some effect modification going on by car ownership, and of course it would be better to look at things like, commute time, how long people are stuck in traffic, and so forth. But that is just unfortunately that health survey was not designed to look at the transportation. But I tried to explore what I could. But I welcome any ideas. So just to provide a recap of results. So what we saw is that the quantity metrics, so it's the NDVI, percent green, and that measure of green space across continuous space, were all consistently associated with decreased odds of depressive symptoms in our cities in Mexico. And that was consistent at both the neighborhood and city scales. Now, we did not observe statistically significant associations between depressive symptoms and urban parks measures and configuration characteristics of the green space. There is some potential evidence of effect modification by car ownership, but that should be explored in more detail to understand it better. And I have some time left, and I'll just quickly mention a few limitations. So as I mentioned, we use the self-reported measure of depressive symptoms, and of course that may be subjective, but on the other hand, we are not using the doctor-diagnosed depression because it may be confounded by SES. Now, the green space metrics themselves are not, they don't describe all of the aspects of green space. So, for example, the fact that the green space is available doesn't actually mean that people use it. And there is actually some robust research that shows that characteristics of green space, such as the safety of a park, for example, or just park amenities, play a strong role for people's desire to use them. And so that would be very informative to see if some characteristics of our parks, may mediate or may modify that association that we see. Now, we also didn't really have data on street level greenery because of data availability, because we did not have the residential addresses. But you can see in many studies these days, especially the ones that use just a few cities. So it's usually more scalable to do it at just a level of 1 or 2 cities where you have the residential address and you can actually measure what kind of greenery is available within like a panoramic view of a person's house's windows. So that could be very informative as well. It is a bit of a challenge because collecting that kind of data for, say, the entirety of Mexico, but it could also provide some more information. Now, we also did not have the data on the duration of residence in a neighborhood. So there's some exposure misclassification is possible if individuals moved. And of course, I mentioned this a few times already that we were confined to using the spatial units that were available in the survey. We couldn't really create our own measure of a neighborhood and measure the green space there, so that is also a limitation. But overall, we really wanted to see whether these different green space metrics, even if they're measured at the neighborhood and city scales, but they still describe distinct aspects of green space, whether they may help us understand or really caution us in the future as we pursue more research on how to select measures for green space measures for this kind of work. So just to conclude, the amount of vegetation, what we find is that the amount of vegetation in one's neighborhood or city may be beneficial for mental health, and that the spatial configuration of green space may not matter as much. But of course, it should also be verified in other settings, and amenities and the aesthetics of green space should also be considered to really understand this better and see if it holds in other contexts. And then just in general, increasing, at least from our results, and of course it doesn't generalize to the entirety of Latin America, is that we see that increasing the amount of vegetation at any spatial scale will likely or may likely be beneficial for boosting mental health. And so making cities greener, not necessarily through building more urban parks per se, but just making them greener overall by planting more trees, even if they are planted throughout the city, may actually be beneficial for not only ecosystem services, but also the ability of green space to provide cooling and improve mental health. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bakhtsiyarava, for that wonderful presentation. And the questions, you got your first one.
Hi.
Thanks for your presentation. I was thinking, as I was listening to you, when I was a little kid, my mother was always telling me to go outside and play because it would be good for my mental health. And back then I thought she was just trying to get rid of me. But I'm open to the possibility it might be true. But this leads me to my first question. I can appreciate that the means of classifying green space, the metric used, would be important, but I think it would only be important if green space is a significant driver, a significant predictor of mental health. Do we see that in your data?
Well, so yes. So based on the measures that we did see, the amount of greenery is statistically significantly associated with reporting.
But how, I mean, there are other, I looked at your models and we have things like gender and age. We all have gender and age and so forth, but there are known predictors like income.
Yeah.
But these things are not in your model.
Well, the income we didn't have in the survey, unfortunately, so we used other proxies such as the marital status, the education, age, sex, and the neighborhood level SES to control for that.
Right. But, okay, you showed some maps of cities, and you had an Argentine city that was very green, and La Paz, Mexico, that was not too green. Do you see greater mental health among the Argentines than the Mexicans?
Well, we didn't look at the differences by country, so we just looked at the associations between. Yes, so I mean, if overall Mexican cities or Argentine cities are less or more green. Sorry, did you say that the Argentine was more green?
According to your map.
Yeah. Well, there was just one example, but you know, Argentina.
Would you expect to see differences if green space really matters, however you aggregate that?
Yeah, well, yes. So in general, from what you can say from our results is that if there is more green space in general, that you would see positive. So you would see those positive effects.
But you didn't look for that.
No, we did, but we didn't look at the specific differences between the countries. We just looked at the measures of the amount of green space in the city. So if on average a city individual lives in a city where there is more green space, then that individual is less likely to report depressive symptoms adjusted for some other factors.
Okay, so it does.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Helen?
So in terms of the car ownership being a factor or not counting, could it be that car ownership actually is a sign of affluence in that particular city, in which case perhaps they're living out towards the edge where the greenery is? I think you would need to follow up and find out the association between the car ownership and the likelihood that they're in a particular area of the city, and how they use the cars, for example, or if they're in the center of the city, you could ask, are they using it to get to green areas, and if so, where located? Because it may very well be that they have the freedom to get out from maybe central cities where it might be dangerous for those green areas. So there's like that's a complicated relationship, but that would need to be taken into consideration, I think.
Yeah, so we actually, in these models where we tried to look at car ownership, the other SES variables were controlled for, so that is independent of those things, that car ownership still mattered. And that's true that people could go to other places, which is why we didn't want to limit the analysis to only neighborhoods, but we also wanted to see, you know, does the green space at the city scale matter? Yeah, but it's true that because they can go outside. Exactly. Yes.
You're not as likely to be depressed.
That's the hope. Yes.
I was a little confused by the measures in green space, and I'm curious whether in those first two that seemed more based on, I was confused what they were based on. Maybe you can speak a little bit more to that. But then two, whether there was a differentiation between, you know, a park or a national park or just an empty, you know, space that was green. Or, yeah.
Let's see if I can go.
I forget what the acronym was in the first one, and I think I meant
Oh, maybe it was the NDVI.
Yeah. How is that measured? And is there a differentiation between like a formal recreation area versus you know? Yeah.
So the NDVI is it's basically an index that measures the like the photosynthesis activity in plants, and so the higher that index is, the greener, say, a tree or a bush or, you know, the green space in general is. But it also takes into account how much greenery there is. So that is just based on sort of the vigor and the intensity of vegetation. So that is the NDVI. The other one was the green space land cover map, and that is the one that just measured the percent green space. So if you remember those green maps, it's just everything that was green within the city was considered, that is what we measured. And so we measured, say, the percent of neighborhood or city that was green. Now for the urban parks, we know for sure that people are using them. So they were obtained by using that Google Cloud Collaborator platform. And so the people themselves actually tag those parks. So we know that they are actual recreational areas. They are not, because we are in cities, we don't really have things like national parks. There may be some just, large parks like, like what we have in San Francisco, for example. But that's what we measured for parks.
I thought sort of next to the city, where the ring of the city is all green, and there's large mountains. In some areas, there are like organized national parks that you can walk through, and some are like just mountainous areas. Is there a differentiation there between like accessible green spaces versus non-accessible green spaces? So as long as well, it's a good question. So if, again, we didn't focus on the administrative boundary of Mexico City, we look at that urban extent. So if those parks happen to be within that boundary of the urban extent, and that boundary is usually, it's like the urban cluster, so they may or may not be there. In terms of whether or not people tag them, again, that would mostly be a function of, they could have. They could have tagged them or not, but it would also be, I think for that question, it would be whether or not they're like within that bounds of that cluster. Yes? Yeah.
Yeah. Have you been using satellite data? There's a huge database worth of satellite data, and satellite data nowadays are collected on a daily basis.
So
have you been taking advantage of that? It's not as expensive as it used to be.
Yeah, so we used two sources of satellite data for that. So the first one was that NGVI. So it's an index that is produced using the MODIS instrument of the Terra satellite. That is the one satellite product that we used, and we just downloaded the raw data and created the summaries for the neighborhoods and the cities that we had. And the second one was that Sentinel-2 satellite imagery. It's a bit higher spatial resolution. It was only 10 by 10 meters. And from that, we were able to look at we did a classification to classify the landscape into whether it's green space or not. And we use that satellite data to classify the map and then derive the vegetation, the green space, the landscape characteristics of green space.
I think one more question or okay. Anybody have one more question? Wow. Okay, there you go. Unfortunately, okay.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, let's both decide.
Okay, you did it. This is great. Just speaking.
Just
here. Okay. Just one question. You're using NDVI, but if you can consider, I'm just thinking about maybe using NDWI or NDBI to catch the building area and make a buffer around it to apply it again for the neighborhood technology. I think it's maybe can be more accurate to find the green space near the neighborhood or near the building itself.
Are you saying to do that to remove the
buildings?
Yeah, well, I guess the building wouldn't really count it.
Not remove it, just to catch the buildings and make the building buffers and to count the green space the nearest link to the building, so we can find the urban grid space, which one is more accessible, which one is not. It's the same, I think it's the same thing as NDVI. It's called NDBI, yeah. Yeah, I've used it before.
I see.
Yeah.
Is it, well, what does it stand for?
ND is, what the word for ND is NDBI.
I see.
B is for building.
I see. Interesting.
Yeah.
I will look it up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll use that too. Since you're the last one to ask a question, please, sir. Go.
So I'm just thinking about the possible implications as far as how you could get people more proximate to green space, and sort of the obvious ones are the ones you kind of talked about, like building parks and things like that. But you could also just subsidize houseplants. You could get the green space inside
that is true.
The residents. So do you have reason to think that your effects, I know you can't measure it from satellites how many houseplants people have, but do you think if you could, you would see similar effects in that realm?
I mean, it's really hard to tell. So I can only speculate. So to the extent that this beneficial effect that people are deriving from green spaces just from being surrounded by something that's alive and green, so that in a way could help. But of course, the trick is that if, say, the house plants probably don't provide the same level of, say, shade, and they do provide fresh air, but it's maybe they don't create the same environment for people to engage in social context or physical activity. So to the extent that the benefits for mental health are derived through those pathways, we could see some effects maybe, but I think the houseplants linkage would probably be, it wouldn't be the same as the outside greenery. Yeah. Thank you.
And just two announcements. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And I know there's a gift on behalf of ITS, lovely flask, water flask. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then for the audience, next week there's a presentation. It's called Fleet Electrification, Insights and Approaches. That's next week, Friday, presented by Margaret McCall and from Nextera Mobility. That's right. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. Please come. And just one more round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.